Hi, my name is Judith Ragir. I've just written a book, Untangling Karma, Intimate Zen Stories for Healing Trauma. And this book is a spiritual approach to integration of trauma and its after effects and how to work with it by exploring the conditions that caused our pain, by being willing to face our pain, and by using spiritual practices to help heal us. I think it might be a woman's way of teaching to talk about stories, which are generally dismissed in Buddhism, and to be very personal about it. So I started to write these stories, and I didn't really realize until the book was almost finished what the impact of these stories were. And one of the ideas I have as an artist, which I've had since a little girl, and I don't know if it's actually true or not, but is to go as deep as you possibly can into your content. And if you're really deep about your content, it will become universal, or it will apply to a lot of people, or it will resonate with a lot of people. So the frankness and transparency was my hope that these stories would inspire and give direction to others who have a very disturbed emotional body, but want to heal and need to heal through spiritual awareness. Can it be possible to use something as profound and beautiful as Zen practice in a negative way? I found the answer to be, well, you could use it negatively. And because when I first came into program, I was very much had an addict personality, and that personality is to avoid pain as much as you can, even though that's not the teaching of Buddhism. But you can use meditation, concentrating the mind, going into mind states as a way to avoid the integrative process that you need to be doing to become a fuller and more peaceful human being. Now, some people have a word for this called spiritual bypassing, but this book is definitely not that. It's kind of like in your face what I had to do to find more wholeness in myself. And I have a way of thinking that's ascending spirituality and descending spirituality. Now, Buddhism in general is of the ascending modality, as is most patriarchal religions, that transcendence or getting over our stories and the messiness of life is the way to go. But my book presents, even though that aspect, Zen practice, is at the base or foundation of the book is actually about descending spiritual practices, really working on your karma, untangling karma, really working on history, the impact of history, the impact of culture, the impact of systems on your life, and trying to help free those by seeing them and allowing them, the patterns that arise from that, to dissolve. There are many paths towards understanding racial injustice, but one of them, and the one that I had, was through love, through really being able to see the story of the people that I'm othering. So I fell in love with Melissa, who was my housekeeper when I was in high school. And because of that, I opened my heart to her stories, her reality, and I saw the world from a very different place. And it's very painful to open up to the other's story. But through that opening, through that love, we can somehow soften our preconceived notions, our prejudices, and come to some type of reconciliation. You do have to be able to hold your pain, because when you do, truth saying, when you do go into the story of the people that you have othered, that pain is great. But if you can hold that pain or acknowledge that pain, their pain, then it becomes kind of an energy or an inspiration to move into action. And hopefully the action, because it's starting from love, will have love and wisdom at its core. But we don't know necessarily what that is until we've experienced what Bernie Glassman would call bearing witness to the pain of the other. I don't think we talk about sex enough. Wholesome sex. Our culture is obsessed with sex, but I would call it pretty unwholesome. What we get from the movies, the social media, models, and all of that stuff. So I really wanted to talk about sexuality, especially because I'm an abuse survivor. And I found the statistic that 1/4 of Americans are sexual abuse survivors. And I think that's probably a small number because nobody reports it for the most part. So this is a very prevalent thing in our life, in American culture. And I wrote this chapter before the Me Too movement, but I'm glad, at least in the minimum, we have, because of the Me Too movement, opened up the awareness of this happens in families, in churches, in businesses, all over the place. And that's only about 10% of the problem is the awareness that it happens and maybe getting the person put in prison. But what about the 90% of healing that has to happen? In my case, lifelong healing, trying to own my sexuality, love my body, allowing sensuality to be a part of my life. This was a very long process that nobody talks about, writes about. I've read there are a few books out about it, but not very many. So, and also not in patriarchal religions, which I consider Buddhism. They don't talk about the body, sexuality, childbirth, all those messy things. So as a woman, I really wanted to write about it. And I also really appreciate my husband, who allowed me to write about our coupleness and say that it was okay for us to share the long process we've been through to heal. And the other kind of fun thing about that particular chapter in Untangling Karma is I used Zen stories, Zen koans from our female ancestors, from women in the past 13th, 14th, 18th century, which showed that women's concerns have always been open about sexuality. And those koans are very, very beautiful and sweet. Kinsugi is a wonderful craft. The Japanese have such a beautiful aesthetic. And this is a very sensitive and terrific metaphor for healing. What it is taking a piece of pottery that has been broken into pieces, and gluing them back together. And at the site of the glue, adding gold or silver or porcelain. And here's a picture of a Kinsugi vessel. And they're beautiful. The second vessel is as beautiful or more beautiful than the original. And I think this is a metaphor for healing. For example, for me, that I took all the broken parts, the pushed away parts of myself, and I became aware of them. I digested them. I applied whatever love, loving kindness, divine love I could to that part of myself. I tried to bring it back in and make it whole. And the gold in that case would be whatever love that I feel, loving kindness or gentleness, unconditional love, the love that I learned through meditation about infinite or divine love, using that to heal my vessel. And I also think that our culture is broken and splintered all over the ground. So I have a deep hope. I don't know how we're going to do this, but this is a inspiration to take all the broken parts and become aware of them, glue them back together, and use love or gentleness to make a new vessel that's perhaps even more beautiful than the old one. I think, first of all, you have to find your own stories. Finding your ethnic stories, your racial stories, your psychological stories, and investigate them. And unfortunately, I have to say, probably there's going to be pain that goes along with investigating your stories. Now, one good thing about meditation is that it helps you increase your capacity to hold your pain or to just be with your pain and trust that the more you digest it, it will eventually dissolve. Not completely. Like I joke that 80% healing is great. It's fine with me. It doesn't have to be 100%. But as the more we face it, the more we can dissolve it. Now, one of the ways I learned from Bernie Glassman, he has passed away, but he was an important Buddhist teacher for me, is to go to places and let the place teach you. And also the place will bring up the kind of unconscious material. So when I wanted to study what do they call it? Internalized anti-Semitism. I studied World War II physically. I went to Auschwitz-Birkenau with Bernie Glassman's group. I went to Hiroshima, Nagasaki with the Jesus for Peace pilgrimage. And somehow going to these places really brought up a lot of metabolizing of the stories. I also went, when I was working with racial injustice, I went to Africa to study slave castles in Ghana. I went to Alabama to the Montgomery Museum, and allowing the place to help me digest. The other important aspect of this is really seeing my stories in relation to the system in which they were created. And in Buddhism, they call this the causes and conditions of your suffering. So when I placed my Jewish suffering in the context of the history of Judaism, I felt more part of the whole, part of humanity. It wasn't just me, my pain. And the same with racial pain or illness, is if we can put it in the larger systemic context, we can learn about, in Buddhism, they call it interdependence or interbeing, that I'm not alone with my problems, but I am part of a collective whole.